I said move, boy, you're holding up my line. The words snapped through the terminal like a whip. In front of gate C-27 at Atlanta Hartsfield, a white airport security officer stood inches from a medium-brown, skinned man in a navy polo and khaki pants. The man's hands rested at his sides, his Navy SEAL tattoo half hidden under a rolled sleeve. Without warning, the officer tilted a plastic water bottle and let the cold stream splash across the man's face, drops catching in the fluorescent light. A few gasps rippled through the boarding area. The man blinked slowly, water tracing down his jaw, but didn't step back. His eyes lifted, scanning the officer as if weighing the cost of every breath. In the corner, a couple of passengers raised their phones, recording. The officer smirked, leaning in. You gonna cry, or you gonna get out of my airport? What happened in the next 3 minutes would burn itself into everyone's memory. The sting of the water clung to his skin, but his voice stayed even. You have no idea who you're talking to. The officer scoffed, glancing toward a small knot of airline staff who were already whispering. Yeah. All I see is some wannabe trying to look important. The man didn't answer. Not yet. His gaze drifted over the crowd, families clutching boarding passes, a businessman tightening his grip on a leather briefcase, a flight attendant shifting uncomfortably in the corner. A little girl peeked from behind her mother's coat, eyes wide. The officer jabbed a finger into the man's chest, pushing him a step back toward a seating row. Last chance before I drag you out, he said, voice pitched loud enough for everyone to hear. Passengers began murmuring, some pulling out their phones. The man's shirt clung damp against his back, but he stood with shoulders square, jaw set. An older gentleman in a pilot's uniform approached, stopping a few feet away, watching the scene unfold. The officer's voice dripped with sarcasm. What's the matter? Can't handle a little spill? How you gonna survive real life? The man finally spoke, his tone quiet but carrying. Survival's never been my problem. A hush fell for a moment, but the officer pushed again, this time reaching for the man's arm as if to force him toward the security desk. Somewhere behind them, a gate announcement echoed, but no one moved toward the jet bridge. The air in the terminal felt heavier, like every set of eyes was locked on the collision about to happen. The officer's grip tightened, but in a blink, the man shifted his weight, freeing his arm with a movement so smooth it barely registered before the officer stumbled forward. The crowd murmured, a few gasps cutting the air. You just made a big mistake, the officer barked, reaching for the baton clipped to his belt. Passengers leaned in, phones raised higher, capturing every frame. The man didn't flinch. Ask yourself one question before you swing that, he said, voice steady. The officer snarled, stepping closer. Why? You gonna call your buddies to save you? The baton came up in a sharp arc, but the man's hand shot out, catching the officer's wrist mid-swing. A twist, a shift, and suddenly the weapon clattered to the tile. Gasps turned to shouts as the officer found himself bent over the edge of a boarding gate podium, his own arm locked behind him. I've disarmed men with rifles in storms at sea, the man said, leaning close enough for only the officer to hear, though his words carried just enough for the nearest cameras. You're just a bully with a badge. The officer strained, face flushed, but the man held him in place with one hand, pulling a small leather wallet from his back pocket. Inside, a military ID gleamed under the harsh airport lights. A few in the crowd audibly reacted, one voice rising above, that's a Navy SEAL ID. The officer's eyes flickered with a flash of uncertainty, but his mouth stayed hard-set. The man's own eyes didn't waver, the grip on the officer's wrist unyielding. The older pilot who had been watching stepped forward, his voice carrying over the hum of the terminal. Release him, he said, not to the Navy SEAL, but to two arriving airport police officers. Confusion rippled through the onlookers until the officers moved past the SEAL and seized the security guard instead. You just assaulted a decorated war hero in front of half this terminal, one officer said as he cuffed the guard. The pilot added, and in front of me, the captain of your next flight. A wave of whispers rolled through the crowd. The phones kept recording, and somewhere a cheer broke out. The guard's protests grew louder, but the officers pulled him toward a service corridor, the jangle of handcuffs punctuating each step. The SEAL released his hold without a word, straightened his shirt, and accepted a towel from a flight attendant who had stepped quietly from the gate. The pilot gave a small nod, a gesture of respect between those who had worn a uniform in service of others. The crowd's applause swelled, passengers leaning into the aisle to get a better view, some calling out thanks. The security guard's voice faded down the hall, replaced by the rustle of boarding passes and the low hum of voices trading the story they had just witnessed. He didn't wait for the officers to return or for the crowd to press in with questions. Instead, he slung his carry-on over one shoulder and started toward the gate. A young boy in an oversized hoodie stepped into his path, holding out a small American flag from his backpack. "My dad's in the Navy too," the boy said quietly. The SEAL accepted it, tucking it carefully into his pocket before stepping aside to let the family pass. At the threshold of the jet bridge, he glanced back once. The terminal was already shifting back to its usual rhythm, but every person who had seen what happened now carried a different picture of the man they had nearly watched get dragged away. He turned and walked down the narrow carpeted ramp, the hum of the plane growing louder. Some victories didn't need a speech. Some truths lived longer when you left them in the hands of those who had witnessed them. True strength isn't measured by how quickly you strike back, but by how steadily you can hold yourself when provoked. In that airport terminal, the Navy SEAL had every reason to explode: public humiliation, insults, and an open attempt to strip away his dignity. Instead, he chose restraint. He waited, assessed, and acted with precision only when the moment was right. In doing so, he turned the situation completely around, allowing the truth of who he was to speak louder than any outburst ever could. That calm control didn't just protect his own dignity, it transformed the humiliation into a public lesson on arrogance and abuse of power. Everyone watching saw the aggressor exposed, not through rage or retaliation, but through composure, discipline, and timing. It's a reminder that in life, injustice will come, and people will underestimate you. But patience, self-control, and the wisdom to act at the right moment can turn any attempt to tear you down into a lasting victory. The greatest wins often need no gloating or speeches, just the quiet confidence of walking away knowing the right people saw the truth, and that the story will speak for itself long after you're gone.